Hello and welcome to another episode of Business and Bubble Tea. Here on the podcast today, we have with us Julian and Zhubei, the co-founders of Venture Education. Julian and Zhubei, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today.
Great to be here.
Nice to meet you.
Welcome to Business and Bubble Tea. And since today we have here both of us, we would like to know, how did you guys meet? How this adventure education started?
Zhubei, do you want to start?
Well, I think the venture education started actually after I took like a late gap year, and I was traveling a lot. I went to England for the first time. And then I also went to Europe and other parts of Asia. And I think after that gap year, I was pretty sure I wanted to be doing education and kind of, closing the gaps between China and the rest of the world for the next generation. Because prior to that gap year, I was working for a very big company. It was in media, it was TV. And we had lots of joint venture projects between China and the US and some other areas. And I could see that it wasn't just the language gap. It was just the understanding, the shared memories, the shared common sense, that there is just a gap. And if we could work with the younger generations, then that would be really cool. And I also was really curious to find out how education could be different, because I was really not a typical good student, quite the opposite. So I was really keen to find someone who, is the education person, who understands how education runs in other places, and also who has a bit of a rebellious spirit, who wants to try and experiment. And then there we go. I ran into Mr. Fisher, and that's how.
So the rebellious spirit in you was channeled, Julian, or?
Yeah, no, and it's really interesting. There's that idea. I can't remember whose idea this was. That you need 10,000 hours to master something. In our first year, we rented an office. How much do we pay for our office? I think it was like 3,500 kwai a month. And I think for pretty much a whole year, me and Zhubei just sat in our office talking to each other. We didn't really make any money or have many projects, but I think that was probably one of the most essential years of our entire organization, because that was really where we started to understand each other.
And what did you what manifested after that meeting? Because now you've got venture education. Like what kind of manifested? What was the gap you saw, the opportunity for venture education?
So we've changed a lot over the last 10 years, over the last 3 years, especially during COVID. I think really the gap was international education 10 years ago was booming in China. The idea of international education was booming. And I think especially among a lot of Chinese families, it was seen as this really incredible option to study overseas or to go to an international school. But the gap in terms of understanding was really enormous. I mean, in the same way that I have a relatively limited knowledge of the Zhongkao, the middle school exam in China. Likewise, you had Chinese families where their kids were studying GCSEs, and yet the parents couldn't speak English and had very, very limited understanding. So I think that's really what we saw then. And I think we still see now is that ability to explain things, to be honest and authentic, and to really care about the kids underneath everything. That was then and still is now an underlying driver of everything we do.
What do you see as the biggest difference in education in China compared to the UK, for example?
Zhubei, I'll let you answer that first.
Oh, that's really hard. I would say for what I have experienced, I would say like education has changed for both countries in the past 30 years. What I know about British education before I ever visited England, it was like, Roald Dahl's book of how he gets bullied in school and how he gets buried under the wooden floor in boarding school. So obviously, and in how I grew up in a small village school in my grandparents' village. We we had pure like soil on the ground in the classroom. And I would say nowadays, for both countries, like I think both countries are kind of exploring, like, as much as, we think that the Chinese traditional education system is really rigid. We did a 3-year project in public schools in Beijing. They're really trying to explore different ways of, fostering the new kind of generation of students. They call it the 21st century skills. So there are a lot of like experiments around, how we can make students more rounded and prepared for the future. But obviously we see in terms of the system, that's where I always share with my Chinese families, if you want to go to the UK, there's a particular entry point that you cannot miss, right? Or multiple entry points, but there is a deadline. And I would say that the biggest difference that I can see that applies probably to everyone is in the UK, you have GCSE and A levels, where when I first heard about the system, I was thrilled because I was really bad at math. So I was like, if I was in the UK, I didn't have to do math for university entrance, right? But in China, you cannot escape math. And so as a Chinese student who was really bad at math, I think that's where I see the biggest difference.
I think one thing I'll just throw in there too, and maybe this will be a sort of recurring theme as we speak today, but I think it's really important sometimes to understand that just because we have the same word in two languages, the meaning can be incredibly different. And I've been in education now in China for 18 years, and I think one thing I've come to understand is that word education means something different in every culture. And I think that's really important to understand. So, it might be in education. If you say education in the UK, it's about young people. It might also be some element of babysitting, that like you have two working parents, so there are different elements to that word and the kind of connotations. I think in China there is also a kind of conformity control element. There is something there around education as a tool for the party or for the government, for the society. So I think just understanding those small differences is also quite important, because that impacts how parents think and it impacts how young people act and think as well.
Would you say it's to do with, I guess, a Confucian, appreciation for learning, or that kind of thing, or?
I think there's a lot of different historical trends that come through this. I mean, I think as well, in China, historically, education has been social mobility. Right since the Song Dynasty, you had imperial examinations, and it meant that a farmer could become a government official. And that idea is really, really core, and it always will be. Here, I have a cousin in the UK who got A's at GCSE, but his family felt like it really wasn't worth the effort or the commitment to do A levels and go to university. So he got his first job when he was 17. You know, that in China is impossible. If you have a middle school kid who aces their exams, the entire village will mortgage their houses to send them to university. So I think there is a really different perception around how important it is and how it can affect your life.
I was really curious about the project you conducted. You mentioned in Beijing, in a school in Beijing. Can we know a little bit more about it? What happened? How did you try to change this maybe more rigid aspect of the Chinese system there?
Well, Julian was the designer of the curriculum then. He was also, before he starts, he was also the most impressive lesson that we've seen was when he was teaching a class of 20 kids. And at the back of the class, there was about 10 head teachers from the school and headmasters. Then there are also about 10 like journalists and cameramen, media around the class, taking videos and photos the whole time. And he taught a class, an hour of class. And after that, there was an old professor who was like almost 80 years old from Beijing Normal University. And he was the professor who kind of leads and guides middle school teachers in their teaching methodology. And he spent another 40 minutes, commenting on how amazing the class was. And it was a moment that I felt really proud of my business partner. And I was also seeing that yes, we see gaps in practices, but I also see how common the common intention between the highest teaching practice in China and the UK, and it's like, for good educators, we all want the same thing, right? It's just trying to reach there.
He had a nice comment, actually, that professor. We both taught the same class. It was the Emperor's New Clothes. So there was a Chinese teacher who taught the class, and then I taught class, and we were both told to just deliver the best class we could on that story. And he said afterwards, he said, the Chinese teacher was like breathing in, and the foreign teacher was like breathing out, which I thought was a really nice way of putting it. So our project in 30 schools was it was really, really interesting, actually, and I think this will tell some stories within it. It was entrepreneurship education. So we were teaching enterprise and entrepreneurship to mostly high school students. There was a couple of middle school student classes in there, and it was a year long in each school, 1.5 hours a week. And that was really interesting because it was, let's say, 7 years ago, and while we were telling them, look, we're teaching entrepreneurship, because we were doing it in English, every school was like, no, it's just an English class. And we were like, no, we're teaching entrepreneurship. So it was a really interesting idea. And it's that kind of thing, does a rose not smell as sweet by any other name? So in the end, we're like, sure, it's an English class. But we felt like what we were delivering on was enterprise and entrepreneurship. And I think it was really interesting. For a lot of the students, it was the first time that we moved the seats away from being in lines into groups of 4 or groups of 6. So just the class, the space itself, and then we would stick things on the walls, have them moving around the classroom. So I think the way that we occupied the space was very, very different. I think obviously the content was very, very different. We did one activity where we asked students to think about where they might be in 10 years' time. And a student said to me in one of those classes, like, no one's ever asked me this. No one's ever asked me to consider like who I might be. And I thought that was really, really interesting. But I think also it definitely also showed some of the challenges. While Zhubei is right, the education system in China is incredibly diverse, really varied. We asked them towards the end of the year, to kind of do something maybe that had some social impact or could have an impact on their school or their neighborhood. And you realized that's something very, very different here in China. Civil society obviously is maybe less common than it might be in the UK. And it was harder for them. If you go into the streets of Beijing and say, I want to help someone, people think you're crazy, or that you're going to try and mug them, or that you want something from them. So I think that was just a highlight that it's not always that students here don't want to make a difference and have an impact, but maybe some of the structures in society or some of the parameters make it a little bit harder for them to kind of go off and do something meaningful. So it's an ongoing thing, and as Jubei said, it's really important, I think, for everyone to understand, the government here and schools and heads and teachers, they're constantly experimenting and trying new things, but it's a lot of change very quickly. In the UK, we've been doing this kind of stuff for 100 years.
Yeah, I guess, and it's evolved a bit from then and gone forwards. And I guess you touched on a few, I guess, points of differentiation with your business and I guess maybe other institutions. Could you elaborate a bit more, I guess, on what differentiates your business from other institutions, and I guess how you see your role as educators?
I'm gonna jump in on this one. I think from the core of our business, a fundamental thing has been that I am British and Jubei is Chinese, and that we are 50-50 partners in our business. And that may sound like a small thing, but I think since the beginning, that's been really important to everything we do, because it means that there is constant empathy in every single decision that we make as an organization. And I think, especially because we focus on international education, we have a consultancy now, we work with a lot of schools and universities and international education organizations. We always have the ability to be in the middle and talk from both perspectives. I think one of the earliest arguments that me and Jubei ever had, it was probably in the first year or two of our business. We had a tutoring side to our company back then. And Jubei came to me and said, look, these parents want this. We need to do this. And I said, the teachers that we were working with at that time, who were international school teachers, I was like, well, they want this, so we should do this. And we both walked away and came back and said, this is really important. What we're doing right here is so essential, because if we were to lean too much to either side, that would cause challenges for the teachers or it would cause challenges for the parents. And what we want to do is find that middle ground. So I think that split has been really important. I think the fact that we really, really care about education is important. That might sound a bit crazy given the sector that we work in, but 5 years ago, every property company in China was trying to get into education, and that's problematic. If you want to sell, cups or tables, sure, I don't think you need to have too much emotion connected to it, but education is different. It's a sector where you need to have a sense of humanity and you need to really care about what you do. So yeah, I think having a split ownership and genuinely caring about what we do. I mean, the fact we're still here after 10 years, a lot of education companies have closed over the last 2 years after the private education law and the double reduction. But for us, this was never about a sector to make money in. It was about the fact that education mattered to us, and it did in the beginning, and it still does now.
Amazing. And you touched on something really interesting there. And I guess a part of it was talking about how you inspire and motivate. But the fact that it's Zhubei, you're from a China background, and Julian, you're from a UK background. Julian, I want to ask you first, where did your journey with China begin? And then I'll ask the same one to Zhubei in the reverse, as it were.
Okay. So when I was 15, I told my mother, she at this point, 15, 16, you have to decide your A levels. And I told my mother that I wanted to be Indiana Jones. So I studied history and history of art. And then when I went to university, I went to SOAS and UCL and I studied history of art and archaeology, still very much with the intention that I wanted to be Indiana Jones. And in my second year at university, I had a professor called Craig Clunis, who is a world authority on Chinese art history. And I immediately then pivoted everything towards China just because he was such a great educator. And I got funding to come to China. This is 2001. I spent almost all the money I got on a train through Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan to China. So I was supposed to spend the money on my China trip, but I actually just spent it on a three-week railway trip. I got to China, and honestly, in 2001, China was just so buzzing with energy, and you could feel opportunity everywhere. And that's the truth. That's really what drew me in, was that energy, but the sense of possibility was electric. The UK is lovely, but it's very slow moving. China was just so dynamic, and you could feel it. And so I basically decided, right, I'm going to graduate from university and then I'm going to come back to China. So I graduated, I qualified as a teacher. I taught in London for a year, and then I came back to China, and I was part of the founding team of an international school here. And then I worked in that school for 8, 9 years. So yeah, that was my journey to China. And I taught history of art actually in school. And we should remember that Indiana Jones was a professor, so that possibility is still not over.
Yeah,
I still work in education. I can still do it.
And and X marks the spot, right? and turning to you, Zhubei, I guess so. You briefly mentioned a bit about your I guess perceptions of the UK. Where did your journey with touching and getting involved in UK education and then where did that start, and where did your interest in the West begin, I guess?
Yeah. I guess from the very beginning, I'm going to go back to like when I was 11 years old. I think one of the first translated fiction that I read was Jane Eyre and Pride and Prejudice. I don't know for what reason, but those two writers were really popular in China. And it was translated, and so I read it in Chinese. And so I was just really absorbed into the stories, and especially Jane Eyre. Like, obviously the boarding school wasn't very appealing, but the whole story of being a teenager and at the time felt like I could resonate with another soul. And so a lot of the scenes in the book just really stayed with me. And so I intentionally didn't really look up to see any photos or anything about modern UK before I went for the first time in 2012. And when I got there and I went to the Lake District and I was just having those, scenery from Pride and Prejudice in my head, and I was like, wow, it's still the same. So, And then I was so surprised to see, like, the churches. I went to see the graveyard of William Wordsworth. I was just going through the UK to those imaginary places, and I was like, this is like a fairyland. So it really started from there. And I also felt like, these things are all personal, right? So the first day I got to London, um, I missed the train. I mean, it's not surprising. And then I got this on a second train, and I was informed that this is a different train company. And that was like, in China you have one train company. But the driver was really nice, and I said, this is my first day in the UK. I missed the train. And he was like, oh, come on, man. Do you want me to help you with your suitcase or something like that? And it was just such a warm, like, lovely welcome to the country. I will never forget that. And I think I was just really warmed by how, like, lovely people were. It was just very lucky that, everywhere I went through for the first, like, my first impression of the UK is like people were really kind and nice to people who is new to the country. Very, very helpful. And then with education, I would say, I went down the very typical tourist route. I went to Cambridge. I stayed in a hostel, and then I went to do punting. And as I was sitting on the punt, and the boat was going. I remember going past Queen's College, and it was about 6 p.m. I think it just had rained, and the sunset was setting on this white building and this big, like, grass, like, lawn. I think that was the moment I was like, this country is magical. It's so beautiful. I want to come here again. How can I come here every year? Not on my own expenses. And how do I make this happen? I think that was the seed planted. So it wasn't anything grand or anything. It was purely a personal feeling of how, just the lovely feeling. And then so that that actually led to our first summer camp 2 years later in Cambridge. And then I also had the opportunity to visit some of the private schools in the UK. And what really kind of hit me was the pastoral care. Obviously, as you could tell from my previous stories, like, everything I read about boarding schools were from, like, Jane Eyre and from Roald Dahl, right? And so when I visited the private schools then, I fell in love. I was like, I want to come back to school again. I want to go to school here as a kid. I want to, try everything, like the art classes, the science classes, and everything. And also, the word pastoral care was new to me. And that really um, resonated. Like, and that's something I've learned, and I kind of brought back to China. And I think it just really reassured. And also about SEN, like me and Julian, he actually booked us a course with a professor in UCL. And we spent a day with this professor who specializes in special education needs. And it was just so impressive to see how much attention and then practice was being put to students who need support. Because at the time, I think that's very new to China, and capacity-wise, there just wasn't enough of that to students. So there's a phrase called, like, the bad students, where the students can't focus in class. They don't. They lose their motivation, or they can't read, which means they're dyslexic. But these were never being brought to my attention, and so that's when beyond just, like, this place is magical and like a fairyland, but more like, okay, this is really interesting. I want to learn about this. So we actually hired someone from the UK who was head of SEN in a school for her life, and then we hired her and we brought her over to China to work with our students, and that's how we saw, like, we kind of worked with the Chinese parents to understand the context where they come from, really empathize with them, support them. Instead of saying, you've done something wrong, we support them. we empathize with them, but then at the same time, we bring people who can support the children. And that was kind of a lovely project, kind of.
And taking this further, what do you think has been, I guess, the keys to your success? I guess you mentioned, Julian, that you've been running this for now 10 plus years. What do you think's been the key to your success as educators, both, I guess, with a Chinese audience and combining, I guess, East and West kind of backgrounds?
I would say being human, being authentic, really kind of feeling and experiencing as a person in it. So everything that we have done successfully was because we really resonated something in there personally.
I'm going to say that word success as well is also obviously a little open to interpretation. It's been a tough 3 years for our organization, and the truth is, we're not $1 billion company. And I think that has always been a tension in education in China, but with us and our organization too. I think we've always cared about our team and realized that was a community that was almost more important than anything else, because if we had a positive community in the team, then that was obviously going to impact on every family or every student or every organization that we worked with. But that comes at a cost itself. So I think we've been really successful at building a positive team. I think we've positively impacted tens of thousands of children across all the projects that we've done, but that possibly has come at some sacrifice in terms of what could have been financial success. Because there's always that decision to make, is do we make a little bit of extra money here, or do we hire that extra person who can provide that extra support that's going to really make sure that children are safe and positive. So it is a difficult sector in that sense, because there has to be humanity, and you've got to constantly make difficult decisions about children and their welfare.
And I guess, so we have time for one final question. I just wanted to ask, I guess, as educators in China, what are you seeing as emerging trends within the industry in China?
So yeah, we do a lot of market intelligence now, and sort of provide a lot of research reports and things for international organizations on things like trends. I think at the moment it's a really confusing year for business generally in China. There's a lot of uncertainty, and in a way, coming out of zero COVID hasn't necessarily changed that uncertainty. In fact, the way we came out almost led to more uncertainty, because things can move so quickly. So I think that we're all waiting for the rebound at the moment in the Chinese economy, and we're not sure whether it's going to, is it going to come quickly? It seems not. Is it going to come at all? So I think there is a lot of uncertainty just generally about where the economy is going, and that maybe it might be starting to plateau out. That China kind of over the 30 years has been such extreme growth, and that maybe it's going to become a little more like a lot of the other Asian tigers like South Korea or Singapore, where that growth starts to slow somewhat. I think in our sector, it's maybe the big question in China is what is the commercial side of education and what is the government side of education? Obviously, there have been a lot of policies recently about protecting kind of public education in China. And so I do think there are a lot of initiatives happening there, but there may be more state-led. And there may be more looking for partnerships, joint university partnerships, joint, high school partnerships, vocational education training programs between countries. These are opportunities in some sense, but probably less commercial, more just G2G. I think within the education sector, I think Zhubei touched on some of those when she was talking. I think things like special educational needs, sustainability, outdoor education, experiential education, student-centered learning. I think it's as much about approach as it is about the area itself. And again, maybe that's the challenge for a lot of overseas education organizations who might be trying to grow or to enter into the Chinese market. Is you can see the opportunity, right? There's 291,000 students, I think, in maybe I've got that number wrong. Anyway, there are many millions of students. Yeah, and there's huge, I guess, opportunity there, but then the risk is that actually what you might be trying to implement doesn't map so neatly onto the Chinese education system. And I think that's the challenge, is how do you find a kind of middle ground where these things can work. So if you talk about something like special educational needs, there's a lot of experts in the UK really, really passionate about what they do. Truthfully, you need to be speaking to families and their children in their first language when you're talking about really challenging learning difficulties. How do you do that? How do you transplant some of the knowledge from one country to another? How do you find ways to collaborate where there's a kind of sustainable model for both sides? So yeah, I think there are definitely opportunities here, and there are definitely emerging trends. It's about how necessarily can you work internationally, that maybe is the challenge at the moment.
Amazing. So that's so interesting, and I think that's all we've got time for today. But thank you so much for joining us, Julian and Zhubei. It's been an absolute pleasure hearing about your stories, both from totally different backgrounds, and launching venture education. It's like seriously making some changes in education. Absolute pleasure to interview both of you guys.